there are things that are going to have to happen beyond this that really have not been addressed yet. One is clearly addressed, and that is that Mr. Starmer's suggestion, or the suggestion of anyone in Europe, of any forces from Europe going into Ukraine at this stage, is absurd. It's not going to be welcomed by the Russians. It will be objected to. So that's dead on arrival. The other thing that I find kind of interesting with Mr. Starmer is that many, many years ago, back in the 1870s, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was asked by a British journalist, what would you do if the British Army landed on the North Sea coast of Germany? And he said, well, that's simple. I'd have it arrested. And of course, his point was that the British Army was so small, it posed no real threat. Britain had a great navy, and that obviously could be threatening, especially if they were blockaded, which Bismarck understood. But I think, unfortunately, at this stage of the game, the British Army is emasculated to the point where no one takes it seriously. Starmer, I think, has embarrassed himself. And I'm sure Mr. Trump knows that. The question for President Trump is, how do you move ahead with the Europeans? I think that Mr. Trump has been subject to insults and offensive remarks, and I'm sure that continues to grate on him. But he does know that Europe has to play a role. How that's going to unfold, how that will be done is right now unanswered. But you can't have a new security architecture in Europe that involves Russia and the United States unless the Europeans are involved.
The world is at a breaking point. Secret negotiations, powerful oligarchs, and a desperate push for a new global order. Macgregor lays it all bare. What does this mean for the future of U.S.-Russia relations? And is Europe being left behind in the chaos? Macgregor paints a chilling picture of a shifting power balance. He suggests that Russia and the U.S. may be on the path to normalizing relations, but at what cost? Europe, weakened and divided, appears to be nothing more than an afterthought. As history echoes through time, the question remains: who truly holds the power in this unfolding geopolitical game? We've just analyzed the perspective of Douglas Macgregor, highlighting the key military and strategic developments on the battlefield. However, the bigger picture extends far beyond the trenches and missile strikes. This war is no longer just about territorial control. It has evolved into a global power struggle involving the United States, Russia, the European Union, and Ukraine. We are now witnessing the full-scale emergence of Cold War II, where diplomatic negotiations are proving ineffective and a major breakthrough seems inevitable. Let's break down exactly why peace talks are failing, what each player in this geopolitical chess game is fighting for, and what comes next in this escalating conflict. When examining the front lines, reports of large-scale offensives have dwindled. The intensity of ground operations has diminished, yet the strategic maneuvering behind the scenes has only intensified. In regions like Suja, Russian forces continue to push forward, capitalizing on weakened Ukrainian defenses. However, in other key areas like Pakr and Chavar, their advances have stalled. Ukrainian counterattacks have managed to reclaim some northern positions, proving that Kyiv still retains the ability to strike back. Despite these localized battles, the war is no longer just about territory. It's about influence, resources, and the balance of global power. The fighting in Ukraine is merely the battlefield of a larger Cold War, one that involves four major players: Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and the European Union. Each side is pursuing its own interests, and as negotiations drag on, it's becoming increasingly clear that diplomacy will not bring this war to an end. Donald Trump has made his intentions clear. His focus isn't just on achieving peace, but on securing access to Ukraine's vast mineral wealth. His administration is preparing a massive $500 billion fund designed to control the extraction and sale of Ukraine's critical resources. Under this agreement, Ukraine will be forced to contribute a significant portion of its mineral revenues, up to 75%, to this U.S.-controlled fund. In theory, the money will be used to rebuild Ukraine, but in reality, the funds will be directed towards American industries and corporations. This strategy is not new. Under Joe Biden, the U.S. allocated billions in military aid to Ukraine, but much of that money never actually left American soil. Instead, it went directly to U.S. defense contractors who manufactured weapons, tanks, and ammunition. The same pattern will continue under Trump, but instead of military aid, the funds will be channeled into reconstruction projects controlled by American companies. The United States is positioning itself not just as a military supporter of Ukraine, but as its economic master. Furthermore, Trump is expected to pressure Zelensky into signing a peace agreement. With Ukraine's economy in tatters and dependent on Western aid, Kyiv will have little choice but to comply. The U.S. strategy is clear: secure economic dominance over Ukraine, extract its resources, and then impose a settlement that benefits American interests. The European Union has its own objectives in this conflict, primarily revolving around the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets held in European banks. Zelensky recently demanded that these funds be transferred directly to Ukraine, claiming them as Ukraine's rightful money. However, European leaders quickly rejected this notion. France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, along with the European Commission, are firmly against simply handing over these assets to Kyiv. Instead, the EU is working on a plan to keep the money within Europe. While they publicly claim they want to use the funds to rebuild Ukraine, behind closed doors, they are more interested in ensuring that the money remains under European control. The proposal being floated would involve using the assets to finance reconstruction efforts, but only under conditions that serve European economic interests. Russia, for its part, has suggested a compromise. Moscow has signaled that it might accept the use of these frozen assets for reconstruction, but only if part of the money is allocated to rebuilding infrastructure in Russian-occupied territories, including Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Crimea. If such an agreement were reached, European contractors, rather than Ukrainian firms, would likely receive the lucrative reconstruction deals, further cementing Europe's economic influence over the region. From Russia's perspective, the battlefield has reached a precarious balance. While they continue to make incremental gains in certain areas, the intensity of their offensives has slowed. This isn't just due to Ukrainian resistance, but also because of logistical and resource constraints. The Russian leadership understands that time is working against them. If they do not secure a decisive victory soon, they risk being bogged down in a costly, prolonged conflict. Putin has recently signaled a willingness to negotiate, but his conditions remain firm. Ukraine must recognize Russian control over the annexed territories, and Western sanctions must be eased. However, with both Ukraine and its Western backers refusing to make such concessions, the likelihood of a diplomatic resolution remains slim. Meanwhile, Russia is leveraging the geopolitical situation to its advantage. They are deepening their partnerships with China, North Korea, and Iran, securing military supplies and economic support. This alignment with other authoritarian regimes is further entrenching the global divide between East and West, reinforcing the idea that this is not just a war over Ukraine, but a broader struggle for global influence. For Zelensky, this war is no longer just about defending Ukraine. It's about holding on to power. He has made it clear that his top priority is not just military victory, but ensuring his own political survival. To achieve this, he is maneuvering to change Ukraine's constitution to allow him to remain in office beyond the usual term limits. However, both Putin and Trump have made statements suggesting that Zelensky is now more of an obstacle to peace than a facilitator. Trump's inner circle is even considering the possibility of replacing him with a more cooperative leader. If negotiations were to move forward, they would likely require a change in Ukraine's leadership, one that aligns more closely with American and Russian interests. With all these competing interests, the chances of successful peace negotiations are slim. Every major player in this war is pursuing its own objectives, and there is little common ground for a lasting agreement. The United States seeks economic control, the EU wants to secure Russian assets, Russia wants to cement its territorial gains, and Zelensky wants to stay in power. This deadlock cannot last forever. At some point, an external factor, a major military escalation, economic collapse, or political upheaval will force a breakthrough. It may come in the form of a dramatic battlefield shift, a sudden change in leadership, or even an unexpected geopolitical realignment. One thing is certain: Cold War II is here, and the world is moving toward a defining moment. The question is not whether the war in Ukraine will end, but how, and at what cost. As we step back and examine the bigger picture, it becomes clear that the war in Ukraine is no longer just a regional conflict. It has become the front line of a much larger struggle, one that will shape the future of global power dynamics. The battlefield is not just in the trenches of Bakhmut or the skies over Kharkiv, but in the halls of Washington, the boardrooms of Brussels, and the war councils of Moscow. This war has exposed deep fractures in the international order. It has pushed NATO and Russia closer to direct confrontation, forced Ukraine into a position of total dependence on Western aid, and revealed the economic interests that drive foreign policy decisions. The United States, under both Biden and Trump, has not just viewed Ukraine as an ally, but as an economic asset, one rich in resources, geopolitical leverage, and strategic positioning. The European Union, despite its public support for Ukraine, is more focused on securing Russian assets and maintaining its own financial stability. Meanwhile, Russia is fighting for its survival as a major power, determined to hold on to its territorial gains and force the West into negotiations on its terms. With all these conflicting interests, the failure of peace talks was inevitable. There is no real diplomatic solution on the horizon because every player in this game is still pursuing victory, not compromise. The only certainty is that the longer this war drags on, the higher the stakes become. Whether it's through an unexpected military breakthrough, a sudden economic collapse, or a dramatic shift in leadership, a defining moment is coming, one that will reshape the world as we know it. But what does that mean for us? It means we are living through history in the making. The choices made in the coming months will determine not just the fate of Ukraine, but the future of global power structures. Will the U.S. tighten its grip on Ukraine's resources and impose its own version of peace? Will Russia escalate the war in a last-ditch effort to force a resolution? Will Europe succeed in using Russia's frozen assets to reshape the economic balance of power? The world is changing rapidly, and we must stay informed to understand what's happening behind the scenes. The mainstream media often presents a simplified version of events, but as we've broken down today, the reality is far more complex. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to like this video so more people can see it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We break down global events with depth and clarity that others ignore. And now, I want to hear from you. Do you think a diplomatic resolution is still possible, or are we heading toward an even bigger conflict? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.